It's January 16th, 1605, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
We Brits call it Don Quixote, which makes it sound like a cereal bar, but still, its significance is undiminished. I am referring, of course, to Miguel de Cervantes' El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quixote La Mancha. Sorry, Spaniards, I tried my best. Published today in history in 1605.
Yeah, and I haven't read it, but you know what? That makes me no worse than the 80% of Spaniards who haven't read it either, because surveys suggest that although this is probably the best-known work in Spanish literature, only 2 out of 10 Spaniards have read it cover to cover, and 6 out of 10 say they've read some, presumably at school, under duress.
Yeah, I too haven't read it, I must confess.
So what are we doing here, guys?
Yeah.
We're not Cliff's Notes.
No,
we're talking about the day it was published.
It is meant to be one of the most read books in history, so plenty of people
Been
have
around
read
for
it.
400 years.
Yeah, it's had
chance.
some time to do that work. But its genesis took a long time as well, because Cervantes was actually an aspiring writer for quite a lot of his life, but it took him a while to get around to doing writing. He actually also had to do quite a lot of other day jobs to pay the bills, as any aspiring or probably even practicing writer will know. It was the same story back in 1605.
A bit more gun action, though.
Yeah, well, so he was a soldier, but he also, after being a soldier, his main literary breakout job, if you will, was as a tax collector for the Spanish government. But due to a bunch of mathematical irregularities, which landed him in the Crown Jail of Seville twice, both in 1597 and 1602. And it was actually while he was behind bars that he is credited as having come up with a lot of the ideas for Don Quixote.
It's so weird that he was in jail twice, and both times they just seemed to have let him carry on being the tax collector again when he came out.
Yeah.
He was, sorry about that. See you on Monday. But it's so strange to think the fact that today in history, when Don Quixote first appeared, he was 57 years old. He was a 57-year-old civil servant with a hobby.
Gives us all hope, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, quite. He'd written lots of plays and poems, but none of them had become successful, and they all fell into fairly recognisable genres of the time. So he wrote sonnets, he wrote epic poems, he wrote farces for the stage, but Don Quixote seems to have struck a chord precisely because it was something that hadn't been seen before, specifically the way that it employed everyday language and realistic conversations in what was otherwise a very literary setting.
So 1,750 copies were published initially. Actually, his follow-up, Exemplary Stories, was the one that everyone in Spain remembered in the 1600s.
But the first part, at least, was successful enough that there were 2 Madrid editions and then 2 published in Lisbon, and then there were others that followed in Brussels, in Milan, and then the first English translation appeared in 1612. And by this stage, Cervantes really was a household name. The time it was taking for him to produce Book 2 left room for a pretender to slip in with a fake part 2 before him, and apparently it was the publication of this fake part 2 of Don Quixote that really motivated Cervantes to get round to finishing his own part 2.
Well, to be fair, it had been 9 years since part 1 had appeared. He was worse than George R.R. Martin. You know, apparently quite a common literary device at the time to be like, and I'll be back to share more adventures with you, but you didn't really have to do it. So it seems like he wasn't really going to do it.
Like the end of Back to the Future.
Yeah, well, exactly. And then this guy, using the pen name Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda, showed up with his new part 2 of Don Quixote. He was like, do you know what? I'll just do it. And that actually apparently was very popular. I mean, the characters from part 1 were popular enough that they were being used as masquerade characters in celebrations to celebrate the birth of the Spanish Prince Philip IV. So they were familiar to the public, and there was obviously an appetite to hear more of their adventures. And that's exactly what this volume offered. And this obviously spurred Cervantes to buck up significantly. And in part 2, he actually incorporated the whole affair into the narrative in a way that feels really modern.
I think so too. It's amazing.
Isn't it so cool? Don Quixote comes across 2 men reading the fake sequel to Don Quixote.
Yeah.
And there's also a part where he's on his way to a joust in Zaragoza, but he changes his plans when he learns that there was an episode like this in the fake sequel.
It's brilliant. And he also then encounters some of the characters from the fake books. So you've got this real melding of reality and fiction in a way that I agree is so contemporary.
Well, you see, you're touching on all the things that make it special, though, because he'd created in Sancho and Quixote this kind of classic comedy duo who could be parodied and could be part of the masquerade. You know, fat and thin, a bit nutty and a bit grounded, urbane and country bumpkin. It's buddy movie stuff, right? So you've got these two characters that are endearing and they're funny and you want to spend time with them and you relate to them. It is Shrek, basically, 400 years earlier, isn't it? Like, it's about chivalric literature and is parodying chivalric literature and having its cake and eating it. So it's like, let's all laugh at the slightly ridiculous traditions of the stories we've been brought up with about knights, you know, exotic travel, adventure, the quick-moving plot, magic. But then you then receive all of those thrills directly.
And a lot of it was inspired by the author's own life as well. So Cervantes had a really, you know, I think maybe unfairly characterised him as kind of a grey, middle-aged tax collector, but he had been through so much by this point in his life as well. So we don't know that much about him because he was from a fairly obscure background. But he was probably born in 1547 in Cordoba. He had 6 brothers and sisters, and they spent their childhood moving around a lot. His father was pretty flaky and had a lot of debts, so they moved from place to place. And then he left Madrid age 21 after taking part in an illegal duel and fled to Rome. And that's where he eventually ended up in the military. When Spain entered the Ottoman-Venetian War, he got a friend to get him a commission, and he ended up losing the use of his left arm during the Battle of Lepanto, giving him the jaunty nickname El Manco de Lepanto, the one-armed man of Lepanto. And once he'd eventually recovered, he set off back to Spain with his brother Rodrigo, but their ship was intercepted by North African pirates. Both of the brothers were taken to Algiers and forced to work as slaves until they could be ransomed. That was a pretty common pastime for Barbary pirates. 2 years later, the Cervantes family had raised enough money to free one brother, and they chose Rodrigo.
Oh, man.
Miguel Cervantes would have to wait another 3 years until a Christian charitable order bought his freedom in 1580.
But you can feel that sense of an episodic adventure coming through the text, can't you? That, as you say, you'd had this colourful life and then put it into this book, which is so many things all at once. It's a fantasy, but it's also a story, and things happen all the time. And that in itself is a comment about the benefit of recreational literature. This point in history, the church in Spain believed that prose should be the sole preserve of historical fact. Poetry is what you use to describe something fantastical or spiritual. And so they weren't keen on the chivalric romances. And then you have this, which is a parody of the chivalric romances. The joke is, our hero has read too many of those books, so he's gone mad because he's reading fictional literature as if it's history. So it sort of feels like it's on the church's side. But really, the pleasure of all of these mad things happening to him is the thing that you like when you're reading it. And it flatters your ego and makes you feel clever. It's the Tom Stoppard thing, isn't it? People feel clever and literate because they get all the jokes because it's about books. Yes. You have to have read books to find it funny.
And it aligns with his own personal history again. Famously, he didn't go to university, but picked up his skills as a writer just by reading prodigiously. So he's kind of, again, both drawing upon and commenting on his own lived experience. I am a man who has read too many books. Here is my book. It's about a guy who goes nuts because he read too many books.
And like Shakespeare, I mean, not on the same scale, but there are ideas that have entered the lexicon generally. People don't even realise they're from Quixote. Tilting at windmills is the obvious one for attacking imaginary enemies, which is what Quixote does at one point in the book. Quixotic as a word, people say without even thinking it's anything to do with Don Quixote, but that's what you're saying a person is. They're being like Don Quixote if they're being Quixotic.
I thought that was so interesting, thinking about like when we encountered the word mesmerism, which came from mesmer. And you're like, oh, yes, of course, Quixotic.
I mean, you'd think with such a heritage that there would be a definitive film version by now, but there isn't. There's Terry Gilliam's Mad One, which everyone knows took 25 years to bring to the screen and then was finally achieved in 2018 and was basically a bit disappointing. But I didn't realise that it wasn't just Terry Gilliam that had spent his life trying to adapt Don Quixote for American screens. Orson Welles worked on a version from the mid-1950s until his death in 1985, never finished it. And Disney tried 4 times over the course of 80 years and still haven't done it.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to see how this could be a really attractive mirage because it's got everything. It's got, as you said, kind of archetypal characters, easy to understand. It's got a quick kind of a modern framing of where you've got the sort of buddy comedy thing going on. And it's got everything in it, like everything that can happen to people happens within the book. But I think that is the downfall, isn't it? It's like, what episodes do you pick and how do you string them together in order to make some kind of point?
It does feel like one that they should hand to Denis Villeneuve because, you know, like Dune famously couldn't be turned into a movie and then he just went ahead and did it. I bet he could do a great Don Quixote.
Timothée Chalamet to play the windmill.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
It was recognised with treaties, including with the United States of America. It had its own royal family.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, part of the Acast Creator Network.